Well, welcome to the Starting Point Project's live stream broadcast for the month of April. We want you to know when our next broadcast is going to be so you can get on your calendar. It's going to be May 31st, the last day of May. So I hope you can join us again. Please tell other people about it. We want to get this information out. We got a lot of great stuff going on with the current series that we're in. So next month, May 31st, will be our next broadcast. Again, if you're new to the broadcast, you'll notice just to the right of the video you're watching, there are some fields. You can type in your name and a question, hit a button to submit it. We'll get it during the show, and we do live questions at the end. You can submit it actually anytime during the month, and we accumulate those. We've added one field, and that is a spot for your email address. It's not a required field, but if you send in a question using those fields and we don't get to it during our show, we have no way of getting back to you because we don't have contact information. So if you want us to potentially be able to get back to you, use that field when you submit your question. And then when you scroll down on the website, you'll see the archive area. That's where we put all the previous shows, including this show. Once it's done, it'll be added to the archive page so you can see previous programs, including the series that we're in the middle of right now. Now, tonight's topic, we're going to jump in really quick, no more fluff. We are doing major issues with evolution. This is part 3. Part 1, we discussed information. We talked about the origin of information, where it comes from, and then how does it supposedly increase if evolution is true and you have a single-celled organism that's going to copy itself and eventually turn into human beings. You've got to add a lot of information along the way. So how does it actually increase? That was part 1 of the series. Part 2, we talked about natural selection, and then something called the Cambrian explosion. Natural selection has to do with survival of the fittest. Cambrian explosion has to do with the sudden appearance of fully formed creatures in one of the lower layers in the geologic column. So we discussed that in a fair amount of detail last month. This month, we've got 2 more issues we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about something called irreducible complexity, and then the excluded middle complexity. Some of you are familiar with irreducible complexity. Probably none of you are familiar with excluded middle complexity, because I just made that up. We're going to talk about a concept that's very similar to irreducible complexity, and I wanted to come up with a name that would describe it. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but it's very similar to the first concept here, but it will allow us to discuss a few other things that technically don't really go under irreducible complexity. Now, as I've mentioned a few times over the past year, there are no silver bullets. What does that mean? Well, fairly often I have people come up to me and say, hey, can you give me just like one fact? I could just memorize one thing. So when I'm talking to someone about evolution, I'll just share this thing and boom, that just disproves evolution and I'm done. And people are very sincere in wanting that. However, there really aren't silver bullets when we're talking about historical events like this. Not because evolution is such a powerful concept, it's really not. But the facts that we share all have to be interpreted. I've kind of pounded that quite a bit. Facts don't speak for themselves, they all have to be interpreted. So that no matter what you throw out there as your argument, someone's going to try to interpret it differently. And it has to do with something we call rescuing devices. What's a rescuing device? A rescuing device is something that someone will bring up to try to address whatever facts that you are mentioning in an attempt to save their current worldview, their current philosophy, their current beliefs. So you bring up something that's very challenging, kind of supposedly showing that what they believe is not true. Well, they don't want to give up their belief system, so they're trying to come up with some way to rescue their worldview in spite of whatever it is that you're bringing their way. Now, there's really nothing wrong with rescuing devices. We all do it. Christians do it, atheists do it, everywhere in between. There's nothing wrong with trying to come up with a way of explaining away something. But the question is your rescuing device reasonable? Does it make sense? Or is it really a stretch? So the point is, no matter what we bring up, someone's probably going to have some response to it. Sometimes it'll sound like somewhat of a reasonable response. Other times it doesn't make any sense at all. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go a little bit further in tonight's program. Now, something else that can be very powerful is using someone's own words against what they believe. can be very powerful in a courtroom situation where you say, hey, you actually said A, B, and C, but that goes against what you want us to believe now. We're going to actually do that with Darwin himself. Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859. He did not invent the idea of evolution. It had been around a long time, but he certainly popularized it. We're going to use some of his own words to judge whether or not his idea of evolution is even plausible. And this is what he said. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, what did he mean by that? What he meant was, if we ever discover something that is so complex, you got all these interworking parts that all have to be there, then his idea of evolution isn't possible, because evolution basically says something goes along the same, but then slight changes happen randomly, and then it goes along, and then you got a few more changes a little bit at a time. Well, if something has to have all of these parts all there in the right place at the right time, it can't afford to evolve one part at a time because it can't survive along the way. It needs all the parts all at the same time. Now, Darwin had a fairly simplistic view of life. He didn't know anything about DNA and the complexities of the cell that we know about today, but he envisioned that somehow evolution could be true. But we're going to use this criteria and apply it against living things today to find out that his idea of evolution isn't very plausible at all. And here's somewhat of a simplistic analogy. Let's say that someone had to get across this canyon. They had to get all the way across in order to survive to even eat each day. You cannot build this rope bridge one plank at a time. If you got up to the edge of the canyon and there are 3 planks there, that's not going to get him across. It doesn't help him just a little bit. It doesn't help at all because he cannot get all the way across that canyon. It's not like he says, oh, I'll come back in a week or two, maybe there's some more planks. So he comes back 4 weeks later and now there's 8 planks, still can't get across. I'll come back in another month, comes back later, now there's 12 planks, still can't get across. He can't survive because he needs to eat each day. You have to have this entire bridge to get all the way across to be successful. So you can't really build this one plank at a time. That's what we're going to see with living things as well. And it has to do with something we call irreducible complexity. This term was coined by Dr. Michael Behe, who wrote the book Darwin's Black Box. And this book is pretty powerful, and it shows that these things cannot develop one little piece at a time over millions of years. So he used this term, irreducible complexity, meaning certain things, you cannot make them any simpler and have them still function. They're as simple as they can get. You take anything additional away, they're not going to work. Irreducible complexity. You can't reduce it any further and have it still function. And what that actually means, you'll see very clearly here with the analogy that he brought up in his book. A mousetrap. Something simple. We're all very familiar with how a mousetrap works. A mousetrap actually has 5 parts to it. It has the hammer there, and I think about 1,000 mice were surveyed, and 999 of them all agreed that the hammer was their least favorite part. The last mouse, they're pretty sure that he didn't understand the question. But then it's got the spring, a second part. It also has the latch, a third part. It has a trigger where you put the cheese to set it off, and then it has a wooden base that holds all the pieces together. 5 parts. If you were to take just one part away, how well would the mousetrap work? Would it work 4/5 as well? No, it wouldn't work at all. You need all 5 parts in the right place at the right time for the mousetrap to function to catch mice. So a mousetrap could not evolve slowly one piece at a time because it couldn't function until you have all the parts there. Now, I know a mousetrap isn't a living thing. This is just an analogy to get the concept across. But I was actually speaking at a state university, giving a talk, sharing a lot of science, and along the way I shared that analogy of the mousetrap. When I finished, we went to Q&A. There was a professor there. He was very upset, stood up. He started pelting me with questions. He was very caustic and fairly rude. And he said, "You used an analogy in your talk. You can't use analogies." I said, Sure, I can use an analogy. I'm sure you use analogies in your classroom fairly often. He goes, yeah, but that was a non-living analogy. You got to talk about living things. And I said I did. Right after I discussed the mousetrap and even mentioned that it wasn't alive, we talked about the human ear. And I went through every part that's necessary for hearing to work. He got very upset. He gathered this book and he stormed out. So the point is, yeah, that's just an analogy of the mousetrap. The mousetrap isn't living. It's not alive. It doesn't evolve over time on its own. But we will talk about living things here, including the bacterial flagellum. This is one thing that Dr. Behe talked about in his book, Darwin's Black Box. Bacteria often have these little whip-like tails that spin around and help them move around and do what they need to do. And they have motors that drive these things, and this is what they look like. They have bushings, stators, rotors, drive shafts, very, very complex. These things are so small you could fit 1 million of them in a single grain of sand. They're unbelievably tiny, but they work just like the motors that we make today. And this is what they look like when they're spinning around. They're fascinating. And there are a number of details about these things. We'll take a look at them. First of all, they are a water-cooled rotary engine. They have self-assembly and repair. They actually make themselves and they can fix themselves. Our motors don't do that. They have forward and reverse gears. They have speeds up to 100,000 RPM. And they have direction reversing capability within a quarter of a turn. So they can be whipping along at 100,000 RPM. Within a quarter of a turn, all of a sudden they're spinning the other direction. They're unbelievably complex and very fascinating. And they operate at nearly 100% efficiency. The motors that we build today aren't anywhere near that efficient. These things are absolutely incredible. There was a website, a secular website, Advanced Science, talking about these things, and the title was this: A Delicate Nanoscale Motor Made by Nature, the Bacterial Flagellar Motor. Nanoscale, meaning very, very miniature, again, fitting 1 million in the space the size of a single grain of sand. But they said, made by nature. I haven't ever seen nature make anything like that, and nature isn't this intelligent force out there that does things that are this complex. It's just basically atoms smashing together over time, but yet they're willing to believe that that's just what nature does given millions and millions of years. So here's another diagram of the flagellar motor. This thing is comprised of 40 different parts. Now, the mousetrap just had 5 parts and all were necessary. This has 40 parts, 40 proteins that come together to make this motor. And here's a quote from another secular source. It said, the complexity of nature's most impressive swimmers leads some to mistakenly believe it was designed. Isn't that silly that someone would look at that and think it was actually designed when they know better? No, this is just an accident. That's just what nature does. Puts 40 parts together to make this incredibly complex motor. Well, we've got the motors that we make today, and we've got the flagellar motor that the bacteria use. They will say, yes, the ones that we're more familiar with, those are certainly designed, but no, the one that nature makes that's more complex and even smaller and makes themselves and repairs themselves, no, that just happened by accident. It reminds me of a little story. There was a debate between a creationist and an evolutionist. And at one point, the creationist held up a prosthetic limb, a fake limb. He held it up and he asked the evolutionist, how did this prosthetic limb get here? And the evolutionist said, well, it was designed. And the creationist held up his own actual arm and he said, how did this get here? And the evolutionist said, it just growed. So he was willing to believe that something as complex as a prosthetic arm was designed, but the real arm, which is much more complex, that just happened by accident. So I mentioned rescuing devices before. So now we have this argument out there that this flagellar motor that's a nanoscale, makes itself, repairs itself and all that, seems to show evidence of design. How does an evolutionist respond? What is their rescuing device? Well, one way they approach this is through something they call co-option. What does that mean? Well, when you co-opt something, you're taking something from someone else or from somewhere else. So what they say is these 40 parts that make up this motor. Well, they exist in other places in nature. So they just came together, fortuitously to make this nano motor here. Well, that's a nice story. Even if they did exist somewhere else, they're not just going to magically fall into place on their own. You would need a foreman to say, okay, we need these parts here right now, wait, hold off here, bring this over here, okay, now you come over here to build this thing. But the truth is, not all 40 parts exist. Only 10 of the 40 exist somewhere else. 30 are novel, they're brand new. So you can't just go to other places in nature and bring them all together and magically make this motor. So their rescuing device doesn't work in this instance. A lot more we could say with that, but I want to go to another example that Behe also mentioned in his book, blood clotting. When you get a cut, your blood will thicken at the cut. It'll clot there so you don't bleed to death. It's a very complex process. Otherwise, if you get even a paper cut, you theoretically could bleed to death. Well, there are about 24 things that happen in order to clot your blood. This is a diagram. I'm not going to go through the whole thing of all these things that are going on a molecular level to clot your blood. There are about 24 events that have to happen in order. You have event A that happens, which then triggers event B, which then triggers event C, and then D, and so on down the line. You have to have all of those things. How did that evolve by accident over millions of years of evolution? If a creature can't clot its blood, it's going to die, and it can't reproduce and evolve. But it can't have event A, B, and C. That doesn't do anything. You can't wait for A, B, C, and then D, or then E and F and G. You have to have all of those in place at the right time to clot blood, or you can't survive. So this could not evolve by accident one step at a time over millions and millions of years. Now, rescuing devices. I have another analogy here. We have this supposed bottomless pit here. Why do I have that up here? It relates potentially to rescuing devices. So scientists discover how complex blood clotting is. Creationists look at that and say, that certainly seems well designed. We can't imagine how that would just happen by accident in nature over millions of years. That's strong evidence of design. The evolutionists would say, no, we think that that could happen if perhaps this happened, and then that happened, and then that happened, and then that happened. We could kind of see how maybe this could happen in nature apart from it being designed. But then the creationists said, well, wait a minute, you just said A, B, and C, but A, B, and C can't work because of X, Y, and Z. But then the evolutionists would say, well, but X, Y, and Z isn't true because of, and they go back and forth, almost on an endless march here. What happens very often is they may quickly get to a level that there's no way you could understand. Most people don't have PhDs in molecular biology, so they're getting to a point where you don't know which one of them is actually correct. And it goes on, and counter-argument, and counter-argument, and on. At some point, you have to decide, what are you going to believe? Because you don't really technically know which one of those guys is correct, scientifically speaking. Unless you wanted to go get maybe 2 PhDs in molecular biology and you know more than both of these guys and you could finally determine the truth. And that would be your opinion. That's not very realistic, because then you'd have to get a degree in molecular biology and astrophysics and geology and anthropology and all these areas of science so you could figure out the truth in every area. It's just not going to happen, and again, it's not realistic. So you can hear their arguments for a little bit, but at some point you're going to have to decide, do you think things that were actually designed, does this seem very intuitive? Or you're willing to believe that particles smashing together over time, they can produce everything we see on this planet? It's going to be your decision. And so the point with this is, no matter what argument I bring up or they bring up, you can find plenty of articles somewhere on the internet to back up what you want to believe. And that's what happens. We can show evidence of complexity of blood clotting. A skeptic can go on the internet right now, do a search, find an article by a PhD scientist saying, nope, blood clotting is not that big of a deal. We think nature can do that, and they're done. They don't want to look anymore because they found an article by a PhD scientist to back up what they want to believe. If they wanted to believe the creation side, they could find another counter article and be done there. At some point, you have to make a decision of what you want to believe. So that was irreducible complexity very quickly. We're going to look at now the excluded middle complexity, again, which is a term that I just made up to talk about something that it's somewhat similar to the concept of irreducible complexity. And I'll do my best in describing something that I made up. Sometimes we see this creature here that has some complexity to it, and it can do certain functions. And we see another creature that's more complex that can do even better things. They both exist. They both work very well. The problem is you can't really have things in the middle of how this one slowly evolved into that one. Even though they both function, and this one is, yes, simpler, it doesn't mean that the simpler one could slowly change into that one. The middle is excluded because it doesn't function along the way. That way you cannot biochemically get from one to the other. The middle is excluded, even though we have things on both ends. And the analogies I'll show you will probably make more sense here. We're going to look at the bombardier beetle. It's this beetle that has an incredible defense mechanism, very, very complex. This is what it has. It's got two chambers in it, an inner and an outer chamber that have some things in them. The inner chamber has hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinones, two chemicals that can be together. They don't really react. They're fine. They're in that inner chamber. The outer chamber contains some catalases and peroxidases. Now, what happens is when the hydrogen peroxide comes into that outer chamber, the catalases, they catalyze things. They make things go faster. They actually speed up the breakdown of hydrogen peroxide, which we use. You put on a cut, it helps clean it out. It catalyzes that thing. It makes it go faster, breaking it down into water and free oxygen. When the hydroquinones come in there, the peroxidases break that down into quinones. And some nasty stuff goes on there. You get a really nasty substance produced there, and it produces a lot of heat. They call it exothermic. It produces heat in this reaction, and that's the problem for the predators. Now, if that's all it did, it would actually damage the bug, this beetle that's making this stuff. But this is what actually happens. It can actually, the bug, the bombardier beetle, can fire this stuff out shortly after it's created, 700 plus pulses per second, up to 44 miles per hour at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. That's boiling point. And it has a turret that it can turn and aim up to 270 degrees, aim that thing around. So a toad comes at the bug and boom, it blasts it, 700 pulses per second. This stuff that's very hot, very caustic to the toad. So the toad runs away. Now, that's a pretty cool defense mechanism. Well, how did something like that evolve? Good question. Evolutionists really don't have a good answer for that, but here's an article that addresses it somewhat. This is from Wired magazine. They have a monthly thing. It's Absurd Creature, actually, of the Week. Absurd Creature of the Week from May 2014, talking about the bombardier beetle. So such an incredibly evolved trait was likely driven by one of the world's feistiest selection pressures, ants. You see, to escape swarming ants, ground beetles like the bombardier have to unfurl their wings from covers and are unable to take flight as rapidly as, say, a bee. Having such a dexterous turret allows a bombardier to hold its ground against the ants to buy time, deftly dispatching the attackers clambering over its body. Now, before I go on to the rest of the quote, what they're saying is this beetle in the past got all these ants climbing all over it. And wouldn't it come in handy to have a tank-like turret to blast these things with this hot, noxious gas, and then the ants wouldn't be climbing all over it? Yes, I agree, that would be very, very helpful. That doesn't mean that it could evolve it. So what did it do when it's being attacked by all these ants and it doesn't have any of those components? It's just supposed to think, you know what? I better start evolving some things. How does it survive over millions of years when it doesn't have the gases yet? It doesn't have the chambers. It doesn't have the catalase, the peroxidase. It doesn't have the turret. It doesn't have the brain that can control all these things. So what if it evolved two chambers, empty chambers? That doesn't help it. The ants are still crawling all over it. What if it just evolved these gases? It still can't get them at the ants, and the gases wouldn't do anything. It has to be catalyzed. All those components have to be there and then controlled by the brain to be able to aim and fire them off. Also, if it just blasted at once, when the blast came out against a toad or whatever, the beetle would go flying the other way because for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. but by having multiple pulses, it allows the beetle to hold its ground. It also helps it with the heat that's created there so it doesn't damage itself. All these things are very intricate, and it can't evolve that by accident over time, or the ants are going to kill it, and it can't evolve. They go on to say this. Indeed, some Bombardier species cannons are so effective that their wings have become vestigial and useless. What are they saying there? It has to do with a concept called vestigial organs. I'll probably talk about that more in an upcoming series this fall. But what they say is that the Bombardier beetle's defense system that it evolved now was so good, it really didn't need its wings anymore to fly away. So they just kind of became useless. Well, how does that work? That's actually the opposite of evolution. It's not evolving wings from scratch. It's taking something that was very functional and getting rid of it. It's going the wrong direction. We'll talk about that more in the future. They go on to say this. Now I'd be remiss in fully profiling the Bombardier beetle without mentioning that it has historically been a favorite of creationists who argue that such a complicated mechanism couldn't have evolved on its own. While we don't have good fossils charting its evolution, we don't need no stinking fossils to demonstrate the gradual development of the Bombardier beetle's cannon. Interesting about that before I go on is that there have been many scientists who have said that the fossil record is really the only way you actually see evolution, because evolution supposedly happened over millions and millions of years of the past. We don't really observe it directly happening today, but the fossil record is a snapshot of how it happened in the past. And he's admitting we don't have that snapshot. We don't have the fossils of how it gradually evolved all of these pieces. But he's saying we don't need it, and here's why. He said, you can see examples of possible evolutionary steps demonstrated as the many species of Bombardier beetles. And you've got everything in between, says Irwin. Thus, after millions of years of beautiful evolution, nature's own little gunslingers ramble along, popping caps in ants, totally unaware of the gifts its ancestors have bestowed upon it. So it's got all these gifts from its predecessors that lived millions of years ago, just evolving things a little bit at a time, and now it has the ability to do everything that it does to deter these ants. Well, we don't have every step in between. And that's what I was mentioning before. We've got different things on the ends here, but we don't have everything in between, and you can't get slow gradual evolution. But Richard Dawkins talked about this specifically. Again, he's one of the world's leading evolutionists, very outspoken evolutionist. A number of years ago, he had a video where he was talking to very young children, and he was trying to show how creation isn't true and the arguments we bring up do not work. In this instance, he had a video where he specifically addresses the complexities of the Bombardier beetle. And on his table, he had 3 vials that had hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinone in them. And they don't react on their own. So he had 3 vials set up with those liquids in there. And then he had some catalysts that he was going to put in there to speed up some reactions. So the first vial, he had a catalase that was kind of weak. So he poured it in there and it started bubbling a little bit, some fizzes and a little bit of steam came out of there. And he said, if a beetle had this with a weak catalyst, it's not that effective, but it's a little helpful. It might deter a toad for a little while to give the beetle a little time to run away. Then the second vial, he put a stronger catalyst in there and it boiled a little bit more. He said that would be even a little bit more effective. The third one, he had a very strong catalyst, put that in there, and boy, did it start bubbling and steaming and all. He goes, wow, that would really deter a toad from coming after the beetle. So he said you could see these steps of gradually getting better and better. That's a nice visual, but that's not the problem. The problem is how do you go from a beetle that doesn't have any of those internal chambers, doesn't have either of those major gases to begin with, doesn't have the catalyst, doesn't have the peroxidase, doesn't have the turret, doesn't have the brain that can control that. How do you develop all that one piece at a time? Because they're useless unless you have the whole system there. So this was not a good argument, but the kids kind of bought into it because it seemed like that might make sense. So that was his attempt there. But again, it's kind of like this. We have a laptop computer here today. The laptop works very well for calculating things, does a great job. Well, we could see how this evolved because, look, we have an abacus, and we have a calculating machine, and we have a calculator. All of those things exist today. The abacus can do some calculations. It's very simple, but it can do some simple things. The calculating machine can do even a little bit more. It's a little bit more complex than an abacus. And then the calculator is even more complex, and it does a better job of calculating things. And then the laptop does a great job of calculating things. So therefore, an abacus could evolve into a calculating machine, and the calculating machine, just by making small changes over time, you would turn it into a calculator, and then making small changes, turning the calculator into a full-blown laptop. Well, even though these things do exist and they can do something, you can't just make small little changes to an abacus to turn it into a calculating machine and so on. So you can have those things in and of themselves, but you can't create the next one by making small changes to the previous one. They're not going to function along the way, and we don't have the examples of the things in between. One other example that's very powerful, and that is the concept of metamorphosis. Now, we're all familiar with how metamorphosis works in general. You've got an egg that's laid, turns into a caterpillar, then we've got a cocoon there, or the chrysalis, and then it turns into a butterfly. For tonight's program, we're going to think about this a little bit more deeply. I mean, really think about this. Because my own experience with my own life and the lives of others, when we think about metamorphosis, we typically say, that's so cool how that happens. We're going to go beyond cool here and think through an evolutionary lens, how did this evolve over millions of years? No design, just random actions through nature. Could it actually happen? So we take a look at our caterpillar here. Now, through an evolutionary standpoint, at some point in history, we just had caterpillars that made more caterpillars. Butterflies, the monarch did not exist yet, just this caterpillar. And so it basically spent its entire life eating leaves and making more caterpillars. It is a lean, mean eating machine. It doesn't have a will. It doesn't get up one day and say, I'm not going to eat leaves today. I think I'm going to go to the beach. Yep, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the beach, and then instead of eating leaves, I know I'm going to get some Chinese takeout. Yeah, this is going to be a great day. It doesn't do that. It just gets up and it eats leaves. And then it makes more caterpillars. And then those caterpillars make more caterpillars, and so on and so on. It just keeps making more caterpillars. So this is going on in the evolutionary past, just making more and more caterpillars. We have to go from this and transition into making monarch butterflies. So how does that happen? Well, by accident, one day, this caterpillar evolved the ability to stick its tail to the undersides of a milkweed leaf. So it's just hanging there. It's like, hey guys, look at me. It's kind of cool. Look what I can do. Okay, so what? How do you turn into a monarch butterfly that way? You don't, but at least you can hang there. It's a step. Okay, it's stuck there. That might not be good if another bug came along to eat it because it's kind of stuck there. But then, through evolutionary history, it by accident, no purpose, nothing intended here, it evolves the ability to make a chrysalis or a cocoon, kind of like a sleeping bag. That can be kind of cool. We've all been in sleeping bags before. That can be kind of fun unless you get stuck inside one, then that's no good. So now the caterpillar is in a sense stuck inside its own sleeping bag. And it's not going anywhere. It can't eat anymore. It can't mate. So it's just kind of stuck there. It's an evolutionary dead end. It's not going to evolve into anything else. So what good is it to get this far, but no farther? It would have to go farther than that. Well, let's take a look inside this chrysalis. We've learned a lot of what goes inside here in this process. Pretty fascinating. The caterpillar actually melts all of its cells down into goop. So now inside the sleeping bag is just this blob of goop. What good is that? It can't do anything. It can't eat anymore. It can't, text its friends. It certainly can't reproduce. It's not going anywhere. So what good is that if that even just did somehow fortuitously, accidentally happen? It's not going to go anywhere. You're not going to get a butterfly. Well, we do know a little bit about this goop. The caterpillar dissolves all of its cells down except for some special cells that are called imaginal cells, which happen to be preserved in little packets inside. You know what's going on inside these cells? These cells have very complex information to make butterfly parts. Well, wait a minute. When this caterpillar was just a caterpillar and it made more caterpillars, why was it accidentally evolving cells that would make butterfly parts? That's not going to happen. But apparently it did. It made these cells that can make all the parts to make up a butterfly, including the very complex eyes and its wings and all those things. All that's developed in a caterpillar when it has no idea what a butterfly even is. But they're in these specialty cells that don't get dissolved. They get protected. And then it uses the goop from the other cells to feed off of to develop into a butterfly. Now, I didn't have time in developing this talk to find other pictures of monarch eyes, but just temporarily, I'm going to show you some other insect eyes that are very, very complex and very beautiful. And all these apparently just happened by accident. So I'm just going to fly through these really quickly to show you a number of examples that are just fascinating from other insects. Maybe someday we'll do a program just on insect eyes and how they all supposedly evolved by accident. This one's beautiful colors on this. This last one, it looks like something from Star Wars here. It's got these stalks that grow out. When it develops, it actually pumps oxygen into these stalks. They get longer and longer and longer. They get spread out more and more and more, and it can still see through these things, and the brain processes it. Very, very complex, but that's a different talk for a different time. So these cells have the ability to develop a butterfly that comes out of the chrysalis there, but we have another problem going on here. You can't just have a single butterfly emerge and come out of there. You really need a pink and a blue one. You need a male and a female. So let's say this particular caterpillar who just accidentally did all this stuff and then comes out as a butterfly, he's a male. He would have to come out at the same time that somewhere else another caterpillar just accidentally went through that whole stage, but they developed all the parts for a female butterfly. So as they were a caterpillar, accidentally evolving parts for butterflies that they didn't even know what a butterfly was, they had to evolve all the parts for female reproduction, whereas the other caterpillar developed the reproductive parts for a male butterfly. So when they come out, they have to be in the same area at the same time. They have to like each other, and he has to invite her to the prom, and it has to go well and all that. And then they have to reproduce. That's all happening by accident at the same time. That makes no sense to me. To me, this just screams unbelievable design, because you have to do that all at once. You cannot just do one piece at a time over millions and millions of years. And we're going to end with looking at the migration details of the monarch butterfly. The big picture here, you've got migration where these monarchs travel up to 3,000 miles from southern Canada and the US all the way down to Mexico, and often landing not just in the same general area of their forefathers, and we'll get to the forefathers concept in a second, not just in the same general area, but often on the very same tree, which is amazing, and it'll make more sense in just a few minutes when we get to that. But here's the annual life cycle of the monarch. It's more complex than you realize. You probably didn't even know this before, but this is where it just kind of makes your head spin. So here we have the entire year from May through April. In May, the first generation of monarchs are born, and they live typically 2 to 4 weeks, not very long, and they're in the US and southern Canada flying around as monarchs. And then in June, the second generation is born of monarchs, and they only live 2 to 4 weeks. And then in July, the third generation is born again. They live the same short lifespan, 2 to 4 weeks. But then in August, the fourth generation is born, and they actually live 9 months. They call them the Methuselah generation. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they're not just living 2 to 4 weeks, they're living 9 months. And that's critical, or they'd be dead. They could not even possibly evolve, and here's why. They spend 8 weeks on a journey going to Mexico. They got to get out of the winter. They would die here in the US. They got to go to the warm climates. So they spend 8 weeks flying 2,000 to 3,000 miles to Mexico. And then they spend the winter months, December, January, and February, in Mexico. And then they spend the last 2 months flying back to the United States and southern Canada to live off of milkweed, which is growing back now and breeding again. So they have to live that long to get all the way down there to survive and then get all the way back and then start again the generations of 2 to 4 weeks for 3 generations again. Now, going back to that migratory map, it's amazing that these butterflies are flying 2 to 3,000 miles to land sometimes on the very same tree of their great-great-grandfather. Their parents weren't there, their grandparents were there, the great-grandparents weren't there. It's their great-great-grandparents that they knew nothing of. How do they even know to go down there? How do they know to get there? How do they know to go to the same area? How do they know to land on the same tree? We don't really even fully understand that. It's very, very complex. Can't even imagine how that's just going to evolve by accident. And you can't evolve that over thousands or millions of years, because if you don't do it right away, they're not going to get down there for that first winter. They're going to die and be done. So to me, this just screams intricate design. I think it's unbelievably fascinating. So those are the two major concepts: irreducible complexity and excluded middle complexity. Again, the term that I just made up to talk about these last few things that we've been discussing. To me, that just screams evidence of design. If someone says, oh no, that's not design, I'm not sure what is. And then you should really ask them, if you don't think this is evidence of design and you think that can just happen by accident, give me an example of what would be designed. How complex would it have to be for you to say, okay, there's something going on here. I don't think that that's just going to happen by accident. Very, very important question. So that wraps up our program for this month. We're going to head into next what we always do, live Q&A, my favorite part. We're going to take our normal very short break, just a little over a minute. Hang in there and we'll see you in just a bit. All right, we are back. Hopefully you are too. My favorite part, we're going to be taking your questions, so we will get right to that with the first question, which is going to be on the screen any moment. Hector from our live audience. We actually have small audiences here when we do these programs, so it's kind of cool to have a question from the audience here. If dinosaurs were in the process of evolving into birds and then became extinct millions of years ago, then how does an evolutionist account for finding soft tissue in dinosaur bones? It is a great question. We will probably have to focus an entire show on that sometime. There's a lot to that. Let me give you the quick backdrop to this. The typical evolutionary story is that dinosaurs roamed the earth for about maybe 150 million years, and they became extinct about 65 million years ago. However, most scientists believe that those dinosaurs actually evolved into birds. So many scientists would say, well, technically dinosaurs aren't really extinct. They have evolved into birds. So you want to see a dinosaur today, just go outside and look up in the trees. When you see a bird, that's actually a dinosaur. So that's typically what they believe, but the dinosaurs that we think of, the great reptiles, they say they pretty much went by the wayside about 65 million years ago. So there's obviously these long evolutionary scenarios involving millions of years for the dinosaurs. With that, we have recently discovered interesting things in dinosaur bones that really shouldn't be there if they were truly millions of years old, specifically soft tissue. We've actually found dinosaur bones that are still fresh. They haven't even fossilized yet. We find carbon-14 in dinosaur bones, which carbon-14, we've talked about that a little bit in the past, but it decays at such a rate that would only take a few tens of thousands of years for it to be completely gone. Well, if the dinosaur bones are at least 65 million years old, there shouldn't be any carbon-14 left in it, but yet we find it there. And now we found soft tissue in red blood cells in dinosaur bones, and now even DNA in dinosaur bones. So how is it that those things could be in the bones if they're supposed to be at least 65 million years old? How do they respond to that? Well, one response could be that they discover all those things and they say, hey, maybe we've been wrong about the ages of these bones. Maybe they're not millions of years old. That is not an option for an evolutionist. They will never even remotely consider that. Because of the evidence? No, but because they, quote, know that evolution is true. And if evolution is true, it would have to take millions and millions of years. So they will never, ever question the concept of millions of years. So their only other alternative is to come up with a rescuing device. How do we still hold on to our evolutionary views in spite of the fact that we're finding fresh bones, carbon-14, soft tissue, red blood cells, and DNA? So here is a version of their rescuing device. They say, yes, we know that biological materials decay fairly rapidly. However, maybe under certain conditions, special conditions in nature, temperatures and things like that, and then maybe the presence of iron could preserve these things longer. And laboratory experiments show that iron might preserve these things a little bit longer than normal. But it's a stretch to say that biological material that normally would decay in less than 10,000 years is going to last 65 or 100 million years. We do not have evidence of that. So that's an example of a rescuing device. It's really a stretch to try to explain away why we're finding these materials in bones that are that old. To me, in my worldview, it's not a stretch for me at all, because I say, well, I think those dinosaur bones were probably buried during the flood, which would have been about 4,500 years ago. So it's not a surprise that some of the bones would still be fresh. We would see carbon-14 in them. We might see soft tissue and red blood cells, and even some DNA, because we don't have the millions of years in that scenario. So it makes sense to me. It fits in my existing worldview, where as an evolutionist really has to try hard and stretch things quite a bit to try to explain away why we're finding these things. So great question. We might deal with that in more detail in the future. Next question, Ron from California. Our buddy Ron has submitted a lot of questions. If you're watching, thanks for everything that you've submitted. His question: if the law of entropy states that systems move from order to less order unless acted upon, what do evolutionists claim is the source of the added complexity? Great question. Again, I'll paint the big picture for you here, and I talk about rescuing devices again. The law of entropy, that's the second law of thermodynamics. First and second law of thermodynamics are probably the best two laws we have in science. The second law specifically says that things left to their own, they tend to go from a state of order to disorder, from usefulness to disusefulness, from energy to no energy, from hot temperatures to cold temperatures. That's what we see. It's so consistent, nothing's ever violated that. We made a law out of that. So how is it, if that's what nature seems to do, go from here to there, how is it that evolutionists say that things get more and more complex over time? You got a big bang exploding, forming an orderly universe, and then you have dead chemicals forming a living cell, and then that living cell turning itself into every other life form on this planet, which is getting more and more complex. This is how they would typically respond to it. There's many aspects there. I'm just going to take one sliver for this particular response. Their rescuing device would be to say, you creationists, you guys don't know science. You don't understand the laws of thermodynamics. That second law of thermodynamics, that applies to a closed system. And the Earth isn't in a closed system, and it's in an open system to the sun. What does that mean? They say the second law of thermodynamics deals with closed systems, systems that are kind of self-contained. They're not affected by anything from the outside. But they say the Earth isn't in a closed system. It's in an open system that's open to the sun. The sun's energy can come in and allow things to act differently. Okay, here's a problem with that rescuing device. So that's a rescuing device. It's a response to say why our arguments don't work. Here's a problem. Yes, the Earth could be considered in an open system. If you draw your circle big enough, you could include the sun. The sun is pouring energy to the Earth. It would be considered in an open system there. The problem is, it makes it worse. You can't just take raw energy from the sun to make things get more and more complex. If that were the case, tomorrow I will go and buy a flamethrower, and I will douse my Honda Civic, and it should turn into a bright yellow Lamborghini. That would be much better. But that's not going to happen. But why not? I'm giving it plenty of energy. The problem is, yeah, there's plenty of energy, but it's raw, undirected energy. It's going to take that law of entropy, that downhill motion, and it's going to speed it up. It's going to make it worse and worse, much quicker. You can't just take energy and have things become more complex. You need a conversion system to take the raw energy to make it useful. And that's what plants do today through photosynthesis. They can take raw energy from the sun and convert it into useful energy. That's what our cars do all day long. They take explosions that are going on under the hood. You're igniting gas and it's exploding. It's random. That would destroy a car, but we have built a system to convert that into something useful. That's what photosynthesis does. But photosynthesis did not exist when life wasn't even here. So how do you take raw energy from the sun and make things better and better? You don't have the conversion system to do that. So it's not a response to say, well, the earth is in an open system. We have raw energy from the sun to be able to make things more and more complex. In that scenario, the raw energy would make things worse and worse. So that would be just a quick response to that. Again, maybe sometime in the future, we'll talk about that in even more detail. Next question, Chuck in Illinois. How do you account for the skeletal remains of what is called Neanderthal? And is there a difference in their DNA and that from Homo sapiens? Another great question. It has to do with the whole evolution of mankind, ape men, which we'll probably do a show on that. When we do our series in the fall, I think I'll include some of that. But for now, very interesting. When they initially discovered evidence for Neanderthal man, it was some bones found in Neander Valley in Germany. When they initially drew the drawings that were in the textbooks and all that, it looked very much like a gorilla, except it was standing more upright and holding a club, so more intelligent than a gorilla. But then they updated their drawings and they kind of admit, like, well, if you shaved and showered that guy, probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between him or anyone else. What's even more interesting is that many evolutionists today admit that we did not evolve from Neanderthals, that Neanderthals were human beings. They were a subspecies of humans in a sense. In fact, there are Europeans today that actually have Neanderthal DNA, meaning that in their history, they were cohabitating with Neanderthals and had children. That means that Neanderthals had to be human, otherwise they could not have offspring together. So Neanderthals were another group of human beings that probably existed after, in a biblical scenario, after the Tower of Babel. They became isolated, some inbreeding that caused some of the special features that we see with them, but they were perfectly human. In fact, they now consider them to be Neanderthalensis, Homo sapiens Neanderthalensis. They call us Homo sapiens sapiens. They are Homo sapiens Neanderthalensis. We're both Homo sapiens. We're just different groups. So we are human, and we actually see evidence that we had cohabitated together in the past. Although the evolutionary stories in the past would talk about us evolving from Neanderthal man, now they pretty much admit, no, we did not evolve from them, just another group of humans that lived in the past. But great question. Next question, Tim in Minnesota. Evolution seems to focus on incremental changes that develop traits which aid survival. How does an evolutionist explain the appreciation for arts or music which don't offer any survival advantage? Again, another great question. We could do a series of shows on this type of a concept. If we've evolved, from chemicals and then ape-like creatures and all that, how do we explain really truly being able to appreciate art and differentiate between something that's wonderful and something that's garbage, or music? Why does certain music soothe us or excite us and other music just kind of grates on us? Why is that if we're just chemicals and particles kind of banging together? Well, of course, they'll wax poetic and write, well, what happened over time is that we noticed certain sounds did soothe us and it made us feel better, and so we liked it and we were maybe calmer and kinder to each other, and so we developed the ability to produce more of that kind of music, and we developed cultures and all these things. And I don't doubt that these things can have benefits, and we do like them, and we can appreciate that, but that really doesn't explain how it actually evolved or why we should like things. What is love? Love has no explanation from an evolutionary standpoint. Yes, it can have advantages, but love can't, or evolution can't explain what love actually is, why it should exist, or what hate actually is. If it's just particles smashing together, we got here by survival of the fittest, and that these creatures learn how to survive, and that's why we're here. So if that's true, if I carry that on, evolution, why in the world would I care about anyone else? I should just do whatever possible to make sure I survive. Why should I care about people in California or in Asia or anything else? But yet we do have those feelings and we do care for each other, and we sometimes sacrifice our own needs and our own good for the good of someone else. Altruism, all these things, particles smashing together cannot explain any of that. It makes perfect sense if we are created in the image of God and we see his attributes in our own soul and our own spirit. And so he created us in such a way that we can interact with people on a level of love and have self-sacrifice. It makes perfect sense in a Christian worldview, but in a humanistic worldview, it makes no sense. We should just all be watching out for ourselves. Number one, survival of the fittest. So those things really cannot be accounted for well, but they're rescuing devices. They'll make up all these stories. But when you really start looking at them in detail, they don't make sense at all. And in our school systems, they will teach all the children. They have gotten there by survival of the fittest. That's what evolution is. They are nothing more than an evolved animal. But when then the kids act like animals, the teachers get mad. It's like, wait a minute, you're teaching me on nothing but an animal, and then when I act like an animal, you get mad at me. And if the student cheats on an exam to pass it, the teacher gets mad. You shouldn't cheat. Well, wait a minute, that's survival of the fittest. If that's what I need to do to survive this class, to graduate, to get a degree and get a job, why shouldn't I do that? Why is that wrong? That's how we got here. And all of a sudden now you're telling me that's morally wrong? I didn't get the memo on that. When did it change over? How did it change? What happened in nature to make it all of a sudden wrong? None of that makes sense in a humanistic worldview. In a Christian worldview, we can explain those things. So great question. With that, again, just a reminder of next month's broadcast, May 31st. Hope you can join us. Please, again, tell your friends because we've got a lot of great information, not just to try to disprove evolution. It's really to strengthen your faith in the authority of God's Word. And we hope you're encouraged by these shows. Look forward to seeing you again next month. God bless.